بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Before we begin, are there any questions? Okay. If there are no questions, we will get into the next unit, and that is the Dawla al-Uthmaniyya, the Ottoman Empire, or the Ottoman era. And what I'll do first is, because the Ottoman era is such a long period of time, there's a lot of information. What I'm going to do is give an overview of everything. This way, we have a picture in our minds. Right? We understand the geographical region. We understand the players, the states, or the empires in existence at this time. So the timeline of the Ottoman Empire is that it begins in 1299, and that is when Uthman, who the Ottoman Empire is ascribed to, establishes an actual state. Okay. Now their efforts begin a few decades before that, but they become an official entity by 1299. By 1453, major founding conquest, they conquer Constantinople, Istanbul, which was huge, and expansions continue from until about the end of the 16th century. The height of the Ottomans is during the time of the Sultans Selim and Suleiman, and during this time they enter the Arab world and they start annexing land from the Arab world. The greater Syrian region, the Mecca and Medina, Egypt, and westward. Another decisive battle was the Battle of Vienna, which they lost, and that marked the end of the Ottoman expansion. That was a turning point for the Ottomans and for the Europeans, as we'll get to. So the Ottomans were they were getting stronger for the first 4 centuries. So the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th century, they were in an incline towards, they were going upward, ascending in terms of their power, and they declined over 2 centuries in the 18th and 19th century, and then finally they were dissolved in 1923 or 24. Their origins, the Ottomans are of Turkic descent. If you remember, I distinguish between Turkish and Turkic. Turkish is present-day Turkey. Turkic is Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all these stands in Central Asia between east of the Caspian Sea and towards the border of China. This is the Turkic region. So they're from this area. The Ottomans come from a tribe called the Kai, and they are the cousins of the Seljuks, or descendants of the Seljuks. So they're all related. They fled from their native lands of Khurasan. Again, this is going to be towards Bukhara and these areas in Turkic lands. They fled in the 13th century due to the Mongol invasions. They fled westward. And we spoke about the Seljuks and how they entered the Muslim world, how they entered Islam. Their story, the Ottoman story, begins with Ertugrul, who is a name that's becoming more and more well known because of the very successful series, the Turkish show, the Resurrection Ertugrul, who it's said. Now, what's interesting is that this individual, Ertugrul, is not really known. His history is not known. In fact, the book will state that, the book I'm reading states that we're not even 100% sure he wasn't actually a person, right? But historians will accept what we call folk traditions, stories that are narrated by the people themselves. They accept that as being, an evidence, maybe not a decisive evidence, but an evidence of the existence. And human beings in general, they narrate stories. I'm sure there are things that enter, that legends and whatnot, but if so many people knew a person named Ertugrul and that his story went, passed down from generation to generation, I think that's a good enough indication that there was an individual named Ertugrul. And this is the father of Uthman. So it's said that he approached the Seljuk Sultan with 444 horses ready for battle. Right? And he was very powerful, and he fought a lot against the Crusaders and the Mongols. So anyone watching the series, I mean, the show revolves around these two people. So one season they're fighting the Crusaders, the next season they're fighting the Mongols, then they go back to the Crusaders, and they go back to the Mongols, right? And he was very successful in terms of his military ability and genius. So as a token of gratitude, the Sultan of the Seljuks gave Ertugrul a piece of land called Sogut, right, which is in present-day Turkey towards, you could say, probably 100, 200 miles south of Istanbul today. A very small, humble piece of land. But that's where the Ottoman Empire would begin, in a small piece of land. Ertugrul died in 1280, and his son Osman would succeed him. He was very successful. Now, what's interesting is Ertugrul and Osman were living the same time that Ibn Taymiyyah was living. So kind of put things in perspective. There was a lot going on during that time, and a lot of heroes were born during that time. And when the decades passed that we're living in, when 100 years from now, 200 years from now, you'll find that during our time of chaos, you'll find that there were a lot of heroes living in our times. SubhanAllah. This is a map of the three empires. These are what's called the Gunpowder empires. So on the west, this reddish color, this is the Ottoman Empire at its pinnacle over here. In the middle here, this purple, this was the Safavid Empire. Now the Safavids, I won't go into them. I haven't yet put a separate section for them, but to give you an idea of who they are Twelvers, I believe. They're Shiites. And originally, they were Sunnis. Okay, they were Sunnis. And they felt threatened by the rising power of the Ottomans. So in order to preserve their land and their political sovereignty, what they did is they converted to Shiism. Why? To have this distinct rivalry, very clear distinction between them and their neighbors, the Sunni Ottomans. And they force converted the people, the inhabitants, to Shiism, right? Why? Again, that's so that this population feels different than this population. Or else if they're both Sunnis, right? Well, why are we this own separate entity? Especially when the Ottomans were doing a lot better than the Safavids. And then here on the right, this yellow shade here, this was the Mughal Empire. I will talk briefly about them once we finish the Ottoman Empire, because they have links back to the Muslim world. I'm sorry, they are the Muslim world, but they have links back to the Ottoman Empire in the Arab world. Once we talk about Wahhabism, it's really interesting. Now, the Mughal Empire was very, very rich, extremely rich. And anyone from the Desi community, I'm sure you've seen shows and movies about these. I saw a movie, the Jalaluddin Akbar, right? And the absolute luxury and wealth that they had. But at the same time, the elite were very much into drinking alcohol and other things. The Muslims in this area were a minority, and they were governing the majority Hindus. But there were efforts of bringing, unity between them that would backfire eventually. Well, didn't benefit us today, unfortunately. Okay, so this is the map. Now, Europe until this time over here is pretty much dead. Western Europe over here. This is Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, right? This is the Roman Empire, or what was the Roman Empire, and you have these states: Spain, the Spanish, the French, the Germans, and the British or the English. Right? But they were very weak. The Renaissance have yet to happen. What led to the rise of these three empires, right, was changing technologies. And this is pretty much a standard throughout history. When the tips of balance changes, when governments or superpowers start to shift, it tends to do with a change in technology along with natural causes, things that are beyond our control, like a major disaster or a series or long years of drought that hurt the economy, right? This tends to shift the balance of power. And you have this going on during this time. And what was perhaps the main thing that was changing was gunpowder. Now, gunpowder was already known. Genghis Khan used it in his battles, but during this time, they started experimenting with it more and more. And they started realizing, gunpowder can be very, very effective militarily. Okay, so military during this time, without these, UN and all these regulations and these extremely powerful countries that are able to influence massive amounts of land, right? The army was very much important. Now, the country or the region that was able to produce the strongest army in the quickest amount of time with the least amount of money tended to be the superpower, right? So when the Mongols entered the Muslim world, they introduced a new way of fighting, a new style of fighting. And if I'm remembering correctly, what they did was the following. The Mongols did the following: on a horse, you'd have two people, one person driving the horse with the sword, and a second person behind them with a bow and arrow. Right? This way, what would happen is when the horses would pass by the front lines of the opposing army, the one with the arrow can turn around and start shooting. Right? So not only are they creating casualties while going towards the army, but even after they pass the army, they turn around and continue to assault. And this was something new. The Muslim armies did not know how to deal with this. It overpowered them. Prior to the Mongols, during the time of the Crusaders, the heavy, not artillery, the heavy units were the knights. Right? The more knights an army had, the stronger the army was. The problem with knights is that it took a lifetime to generate these people. Right? You need to take these young children and train them for years upon years upon years and spend a lot of money on them. So although they were effective in battle, it was hard to produce them. It was costly. It took a lot of time. So when gunpowder is now introduced, they are able to amplify the strength of their military without as much money, without as much time. Because now it's about training someone to use a cannon, rather than training someone with a sword and a bow and arrow and how to ride a horse and all that. Right? So what would happen is these three empires would start experimenting with it. The Ottomans were able to most effectively use it. And therefore they were the most powerful for a very long time. So a strong empire is one that has a strong army. We went through this, Mongols, who said this. Right? We mentioned this as well. So this is Osman. This is a rendering or a picture illustration of him. He seems like he was on the chubby side, but he was very effective in battle. And Osman, technically, he didn't really make a lot of expansions. Right? Major expansions aren't credited to him. But what Osman did was revive this concept of jihad as being an essential part of the government. So the title of Osman was Ghazi, which means a frontier warrior. He was the warrior. And you'd find that him and the next 10, or him included with the next 9 sultans of the Ottomans, they were very much warriors. In fact, one of them even died in battle. Right? So they revived this element of offensive jihad, and that brought them a lot of prestige and a lot of power. So when Osman died, he had the sultanate here. So this is these are the empires or the states during the time of Osman. You have the three. You have the Ilkhanids, which we spoke about. These are the Mongols who converted to Islam, and they took over this area. This is the one who I said that Ibn Taymiyyah was dealing with, and they wanted to enter Damascus, and there was a problem. How did the fuqaha, how could they perceive this? How can they fight? Among other things. And then you still have the Mamluk Sultanate over here. Right? And then you have the humble Uthmani Sultanate. Now, when you look at this, what the Uthmanis do is the following. And this is very interesting. The Uthmanis, right, they're part of a series, or there are many Turkic tribes, right? All go back to the same region. They're cousins of one another. And even the show, Ertugrul, shows this. And sometimes there's rivalry between them. Okay? So with Uthman and the next sultan, what they do is they decide to not enter these areas. So the various Turkic tribes are in this area over here. Central and east part of present-day Turkey. Uthman is over here. They decide, let's not deal with them. We're not going to expand eastward, rather we're going to expand into Europe. That's exactly what they do. And they were very successful. Now, one of the sultans later on said, you know what, I'm not going to stick to the advice of my forefathers, I'm actually going to spread eastward. And this created a lot of rivalry. The Turkic tribes end up seeking help from the remaining Mongols or the people of this region. One of them was, his name is Timur Lane, or Timur the lame one, because it said that he had there was some sort of he had some sort of problem, either mentally or physically, right? And what he did, he was very ambitious. He wanted to do what Genghis Khan did, and that is take all of the land and put it under one empire. Okay, so what he did was he would go around and enter these areas. But the difference between him and Genghis Khan is when he would enter, he would absolutely annihilate everyone. He'd kill everyone. So Azerbaijan got hit hard, and these areas got hit hard. Damascus even got hit. There's actually an interesting story with Ibn Khaldun. So Ibn Khaldun is alive during the reign or the expansion of Timur Lane. And that is, once Timur Lane got close to the borders of Damascus, the people of Damascus, or the Emir, sent people out to talk to him and see if they can negotiate. So Timur Lane said, okay, I want this much money, this much money. And Ibn Khaldun is part of the process. And they said, okay, you got to promise you're not going to do anything. You're going to promise you're not going to enter our lands. He said, I promise, I'll give you oath, you have my word, etc. He breaks his oath. Comes in and does a lot of damage here. He's stopped by the Mamluks. In terms of expansion-wise, at this time there was the Sultan of the Mamluks was a Circassian named Barquqi. And he said, look, if you come near us, we're going to annihilate you. And he doesn't. He recognizes that they're more powerful than him. Eventually, Timur dies, and that pretty much his dynasty splits apart, and the whole 9 yards. But what happened is they do attack the Ottomans, and it severely slows down their progress for about 2 or 3 decades. But later on, they recover, and then they start expanding eastward, and they go down here. I think this is the next map. Yeah, so this is the process of their expansion. I think we take for granted the amount of land of Europe that was under the Ottoman Empire. Right? I didn't realize they got very deep into Europe, right here. All of this, right? Greece, I believe Hungary, and the Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, all these areas, parts of maybe, I think this is probably Russia today. Yeah. So they got deep into Europe, and then they stop at Vienna. Or they're stopped at Vienna, I should say. Okay, so that was their vision. Go this way, let's not have to deal with our rival tribes and the Muslims over here. But eventually they overturned that, and they spread south and eastward. No. So this is the timeline of their expansion. And as I mentioned, it starts off over here. This is Istanbul, right? And this is Bursa. So during the Uthman's time, he takes this region over here. So you can see this tannish type color over here. That is during his time. And even this brown area over here. Bursa becomes the capital of the Ottomans until Muhammad al-Fatih, the conqueror, takes Istanbul, Constantinople, and then they start going this way. They get this earlier on, and then as time goes on, during the reign of Sultan Selim, he takes a lot of land. He takes Syria, he takes the eastern part, the Hijaz, which is Mecca and Medina, towards the border or to Yemen, and he takes this area as well, Egypt, Cairo, this area, and also present-day Algeria. Now you might ask, well, why didn't it take this region over here, right, or down here, which would be present-day Libya, Algeria, Tunis, and all these? This was desert land. These were nomads. Nomads were in this region, and prior to modern times, with our current technology, really the government can't control all of this. They don't have the resources to control this, and there's really no population. It's pure desert land. Therefore, they just kind of left it, right? Okay, so perhaps one of the pinnacles or one of the high points of the Ottoman Empire is when they took the Constantinople. Now, Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which I believe we mentioned before. They were very wealthy. The Byzantine Empire was very wealthy. So I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again to to refresh our minds, during this era, the rich Muslim lands was Syria, Damascus, Cairo, Istanbul, these areas. The rich European areas were the western part of Europe. Now today it's opposite. The rich European lands are the western part, France, Germany, these areas, England. These were the poor areas before. Now they're the rich one. The poor areas of Europe is what today? The eastern part. And in fact, they still have this kind of animosity toward the Western Europe has animosity towards. They're not okay with the eastern part. That's why some of these countries aren't part of the EU. Why? Because you guys were the Byzantine Empire before, subhanAllah. Human beings. Now today, in our times, the rich Muslim areas is the Gulf, right? Back in the day, it was the poorest areas. So they try many times. The first few sultans try to take Constantinople. They fail. Muhammad al-Fatih is the one who does it. Now, before taking Constantinople, it was hit hard by the Crusaders, by the Fourth Crusaders. So they do a lot of damage to Constantinople. And when they start recovering, that's when the Ottomans come and take it. Okay? So they weren't as strong as they were prior to these events, which gave the Uthmanis an opportunity to take it. So Constantinople is a prize. I mean, Istanbul, till this day, Istanbul is a phenomenal city. I mean, it's massive. So much wealth, so rich. And it was like that during that time, because if you look at it geographically, it's pretty much the link between Europe and Asia. So without this, you have to go all the way around, right? So it's very strategic. Now, anyone from the European world who wants to come to the Muslim world, which was happening quite often, right? You had people from Europe come to Baghdad to study, go to Cairo, whatever it is. Right? Now they have to go through this. So this is a major business hub. And it's a connection between, or a border between two worlds. Right? So it was taken by Muhammad al-Fatih, Muhammad II. Yes. Now, I'm going to be skipping like century now. In 1492, which is shortly after the taking of Constantinople, this is a very critical time. And that is because seeds of a new world will be planted during these few decades. So 1942 is significant for what? Is when Columbus either set sail or landed in or found America, what we call America today. So also in the 1440s, the printing press is invented, is discovered, it's made, established, which helped publish a lot of books. And with the increased amount of books and the easier publication, right, it costs less. Now more people have access to books. Right now here in America, a book you're going to pay $15, $20 for a book. Well, I mean, that's not cheap. Imagine if you're someone who likes to read a lot, and that's going to add up. Now, alhamdulillah, we have other options like buying a used book, which is always a better option because a lot of these used books, really, they're perfectly fine. But when these books are expensive, it's harder to spread literature and research, right? But when you have the printing press, now printing is actually a lot easier. Prior to the printing press, the way books were printed, if you will, not really printed, the way books were made was a scribe, a writer would copy a book. So would take a book from beginning to the end and they'd copy it, nasikh. And this was a profession. People would do this. But imagine how long it would take to write an entire book. I mean, if you're working full time, it might take you an entire week to write one book, right? And now you have to pay the individual for doing that. The Muslims never adopted or never took the printing press. Europe presented it to the Muslim world, and they refused it. And Yasir Qadi has a very interesting lecture on this, so you look it up and see the information. But, I mean, this hurt the Muslim culture, as we will see in a moment. You also have Martin Luther of the Reformation, when Protestantism was born and it split from Catholicism. That was very crucial because now it has a new mode of looking at faith that's more capable of, it's more accessible to the public, also more capable of incorporating sciences, right, which the Catholicism and the church had a lot of problem with. Now, the church was very corrupt during this time. So the Protestants really broke away from that and presented a new model. Columbus set sail to America. Now, Columbus was looking for India. Why was he looking for India? Spices. Spices, back in the day, is like petrol today. It was the money, right? So why did he have to go westward in order to find India? Because the Muslims had so much control over the Mediterranean Sea, right? It said that a piece of wood couldn't float in the Mediterranean Sea without the permission of Muslims. Right? That's how much power the Ottoman Empire had over that area. So Columbus had to set westward, hoping to find another route to India. And once they landed in America, right, they started calling the natives, what did they start calling them? Indians. I always wondered why they called them Indians. It's because they thought they landed in India. They were looking for India, right? But that would put a seed for what would be called, a new era, the modern times. On the same year, a major inquisition expels Jews and Muslims from Spain who take refuge in the Ottoman Empire, right? So during this time, the Muslims lose Spain. And with the loss of Spain, right, the Europeans now have access to so much information, so much research, such rich scholarship was in that land. And now they take it and they start learning from it. And perhaps this is one of the reasons, if not one of the primary reasons, that ignites the Renaissance. Right? And perhaps, one theory that I heard, perhaps these Spaniards, these inquisitors, they found maps by the Muslims that show a land across the sea. That there's some theories that Muslims from China actually landed in America in the 9th century. And perhaps that explains the kindness of the Native Americans towards the hospitality, right? Perhaps. Again, this is all just theory crafting here, food for thought, questions on our mind. Were there Muslims in the ship that landed to America? It's a very big topic, a very growing topic across the Muslim American discourse. And we'll talk about that, inshallah, once we get to Islam in America, which will be the final unit. So as the Ottomans are rising, there's another world that's being built from scratch. So in the 16th century, this is the most powerful time of the Ottomans. This is the height. This is their zenith during the time of Sultan Selim and Sultan Suleiman. This is their apogee of Ottoman power and wealth. They were so powerful that a visitor from Mars, so someone were to come from Mars, doesn't know anything about Earth, and just kind of looks at a macro view of the world in the 1500s, they would have said that Muslims are about to own the entire world. That's how powerful they were. But again, there was seeds of another trajectory, what we call now today the Western world and modernity, have been sown, and the Ottomans don't know about this, not yet. This is Selim the Grim. The Grim, I don't know if Muslims call him the Grim or this is the Westerners, but they call him the Grim because he killed 12 brothers of his brothers. And I guess this was a custom of the Ottoman sultans. To prevent any internal fighting, right, the sultan would kill all of his brothers so that no one can challenge him to the throne. And we know it's absolute chaos when this occurs, right? So, in Saudi Arabia today, now I'm sure there's a lot of internal fighting. And just because we don't see on the outside, who knows if there's a plot brewing from the inside. I guess time will tell us. So Sultan Selim says, a carpet is large enough to accommodate 2 Sufis. 2 Sufis can sit on a carpet. But the world is not large enough for 2 kings. And this is the mentality, right? Anyone who tries challenging me, you're done. Or anyone who's even a potential threat, a potential challenge, needs to be dealt with. So he put brothers and his nephews to death upon ascension for fear of civil war. So it wasn't just brutality and just evil, but rather it's politics at its worst. So he's the first Ottoman Sultan to claim the title Caliph. Why? Because during this time he annexed Egypt. So I showed you that. Now a lot of the Muslim world is under the Ottoman Empire. And he also is titled the custodian of the two holy mosques. So the Mamluks, Baybars, was the first one to be titled the servant of the two mosques. And then the Ottomans were also titled that once they took Mecca and Medina, and that title continues to the House of Saud today. During his time, you have the first clashes with the Safavid Empire. They defeat them in a particular area in 1514, to capture Safavid capital, Tabriz, but abandon it. Right? So it seems like they didn't have too much interest in actually harming or entering Safavid lands. It was kind of just there, right? You're rivals, we don't like you, but we're not too concerned about the land itself. And then you have Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman also has a series in Turkish, but they portray him as a womanizer pretty much. He's just all these women are everywhere, and the story isn't. He's not the main character. The main character of the story is one of his would-become wives, or I guess they had this system where if he has slave girls, right, or concubines, I should say, and if one of them gives birth to a child, she gets a greater rank, right? And there was a possibility of the caliph to be transferred to that child. And then you have a lot of rivalries between these various women, right? I don't know how much of that is true. This is how the show portrays it. And I'm sure there's a lot of inaccuracies. They just want to portray him as like the guy who's just, his life is just problems with women, right? So during his time, the Ottomans and the Ottoman and Safavid wars, it's also the golden age of culture and prosperity. Again, no serious ambition towards the Safavid. I mentioned that. The Ottomans were far superior in terms of the army. So the Ottoman army was 3 times the size of the Safavid army. But again, they had no real ambition of conquering it. During his time, expansions start to slow down, if not halt. And they start focusing more on bureaucracy and consolidation. Let's focus on the interior affairs of our land. And that's why he's called the lawgiver, or Qanuni, right? The lawgiver. Why? Because he starts really establishing a very strong administration. I'll talk about their administration in the next slide, in the next slide. So he worked with the famous Ottoman Hanafi jurist, the Grand Mufti Abu Saud Effendi. He has a very large tafsir, and he's definitely a very, very prominent scholar. And again, the Ottoman Empire starts transforming from a imperialistic type empire where it's conquering and taking land to a one that's focusing more on bureaucracy and internal affairs. So let's look at the Ottoman Empire, their administration. Now, perhaps their administration was the strongest when you compare it to the other administrations of the Muslim dynasties or eras. Why? Because perhaps it's the Turkic mind that differs from Arabs or the Persians, who might be a little bit more simplistic than the Turks. What was I going to say? Also, the Ottoman Empire, perhaps one of the reasons why it lasted so long, it lasted 600 years, 400 of which it was officially the Ottoman Empire, was because of their administrative power. And their administrative power comes from the system, as I'll talk about. Now, society was 2 classes. You had the ruling class, and you had the Ra'i class, Ra'iyya, they called it, which was the commoners. And in each class, you had these groups. So when it comes to the ruling class, there were 4 branches. You had the administrative branch, which was the Sultan and his people, the viziers, who were running the country and the affairs of the country. You had the scribes. The scribes would be what we call today the Ministry of Finances, right? That which has to do with the economy. And they had a very strange system when it comes to the revenue of the country and the budget. Not the budget, the revenue of the country. So these scribes, essentially they were hired by the administration to collect taxes from the citizens, from Muslim citizens, as I'll talk about. And what the administration would do is say, okay, whatever taxes you collect, you give us a percentage of it, and the rest is yours. Now, this seems very strange. And I was trying to think about it. Again, I didn't do much research into this, but perhaps the idea is the following: that if you give them this type of salary where it's percentage based, it will encourage them to try and collect more. The more they collect, the more that's going in their pocket. But at the same time, the more that's going to go into the Ottoman pocket, right? Also, this helps separate the powers of the state. So the administration didn't have direct access to the economy or the budget or the income or the revenue of the country. You had the military. Now the military was similar to the Abbasids. Now if you remember, the Abbasids would import children, boys from the Turkic region, Central Asia, at a young age. Many times the families would actually willingly give their children to be slaves of the Abbasids to be trained. So they would train them for 10 years, they would serve, they would be given the military training, the education that they need, and after 10 years, their contract is over and they're freed. Right? That's what spawned the Mamluks, who became extremely powerful. Right? So you have a similar system going on during the Ottoman Empire, but they were taking from European lands. Right? So European families had the opportunity of giving their child to the Ottoman Empire, who they would train them, teach them, right? And through the process, they would become Muslims, and then they would become these elites. Right? They would become these people of high status. They had a cultural branch. And what's interesting, they call it the cultural branch, but really it's the branch of the ulama. This is where the ulama are. And the ulama were responsible for legislation. They're the ones who made the laws. They're the one responsible for executing the laws, the court systems, right? And again, these branches are separate from one another. And I mentioned before that at one point the ulama were so powerful, the Hanafi jurists were so powerful, they can bring down a sultan. I mean, a great sultan, they can bring them down. So they had a very effective distribution of power and a balance of power. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why they were so powerful and they were so effective at what they did. Now, the cultural class tended to also represent the commoners, and they served as a type of buffer between the politicians and the commoners, right? And then when it comes to the Ra'i class, the commoners, you had several groups. You had Sufi orders, you had trade guilds, you had athletic clubs. Yes, athletic clubs, right? Athletes. What we call today athletes. You had athletes during that time who would train with one another. And they formed clubs or groups. Now, the way I'm perceiving this is when we compare it to our time today, you have unions, for example. You have these parties, for example, right? And they serve as a type of lobby to the government. Right? And the stronger they become, the more effective they become when it comes to politics and the more influence they have on politicians. So it seems like this was something that was going on even back then. These Sufi groups, if they got strong enough, they had powerful leadership, well, they can go a long way. The same thing with these trade guilds and these athletic guilds. Perhaps the most interesting part of this, the Ra'i class, with these what's called the millet groups, from millah, which means religion, or some sort of creedal bond. The millet groups was a system that was implemented by the Ottomans. Now, what this is the following. Anyone who was not a Muslim was part of a millet. So the Christians had a millet, and the Christian millet had a leader. The Jews had a millet, and they would appoint a rabbi to be their leader. Right? So all these different religious minorities, in fact, what's interesting is that there's a lot of interesting things here. The Muslims in the Ottoman Empire were about 49%. 49% of the citizens or the residents of the Ottoman Empire were Muslims. 51% were non-Muslims. Now, don't forget that Iraq and the Persian area, and then the Bangladesh and Pakistan, these areas which are much more heavily populated than the Arab world, right? This is where most of the Muslims are. But in terms of the Ottoman Empire, there was a balance between Muslims and non-Muslims. So these millet groups were part of the Ottoman Empire. They lived in Ottoman lands. But what's interesting is that these lands or these people remained sovereign. They were their own entity. So although they were part of the Ottoman Empire, they weren't bound by Ottoman law. Why? How? Well, if you remember the diagram that I showed you, the Venn diagram, how the Muslims were able to reconcile between theocracy, right, religious law, and non-Muslims. We cannot apply our religious law that we take from Quran and Hadith on people who don't believe in Quran and Hadith in the first place, right? So this is one of the ways they do that. They were under the Ottoman Empire, but they were sovereign in that they weren't bound by Ottoman law, nor were they responsible for Ottoman law. They had their own law, and that's in line with Islam. So law wasn't binding based on the land that you live. Rather, law was binding based on the religion you follow. So it's not like our times today in nation states. As soon as you enter, you put your foot on American soil, you are bound by American law. Whoever you are. You know the law or not, you are bound by it. As soon as you leave America and you go to China, as soon as you set your foot in China, you are bound by Chinese law. That's how it is. Back in the day, it wasn't like that. Law isn't binding based on land, it's binding based on the religion you follow. So non-Muslims were not bound, or they were not obligated to follow Ottoman law. They had their own law that they used. So European lands were part of the Ottoman Empire, but its people remained sovereign. And perhaps an example of that today is what we call U.S. territories. Right? So Puerto Rico and the Solomon Islands, I think the Virgin Islands as well. They're U.S. territory, but they're not states of the U.S. What does that mean? Well, they're part of the U.S., but they're not bound by the U.S., etc. They might pay Social Security and the taxes, but there's this type of distinction here, right? So this is what was going on then. People living in Europe, Greece, for example, and these areas, they were living completely normal lives, right? Being under the Ottoman Empire did not affect them. So now the question is, well, what's the point of them being under the Ottoman Empire if they're not going to be bound by its laws or pay taxes, right? The benefit was trade. The trade that goes on. This is what the Muslims really focused on. If you remember, throughout all of these dynasties, there was a common theme in terms of administration. They were more concerned with bureaucracy and the economy than the theology. That's just the reality. Even the most extreme dynasties like the Fatimids, they weren't concerned with converting people. They were concerned with the economy, right? So Europeans were free from having to obey Ottoman law or pay local taxes, and the deal was reciprocal in that the Muslim merchants were free from the same obligations while in European lands. So it worked very well for trade, and everyone was happy. Okay, now we're fast forwarding to the next century, the 17th century, and the turning point of the Ottomans. This is when the Ottomans go from an increase to a decline, right? And that is the Battle of Vienna. And it said that there were two battles that the Muslims lost, where if they didn't lose them, they would have taken all of Europe. The first one was in France during the time of the Umayyads, right? They lost in that battle. And then the second one was their loss in Vienna. If they had to have successfully taken Vienna, they would have probably taken all of Europe. And the same thing during the time of the Umayyads, if they were to have taken or been victorious in the battle in France, they would have taken maybe all of Europe. So this defeat ends the expansion of the Ottomans. It said that there were certain natural reality or certain natural events that occurred, like heavy rain. So the Ottomans, what made their army so powerful was the cannons. They were able to use the gunpowder to make cannons, and all they had to do was drag these cannons, and now they're throwing explosives, right? Not catapults. It's very different between a cannon is not that big, but a catapult is enormous, and now you have to put the rock there and all that stuff. So cannons, all they had to do was kind of push the cannon. But with a lot of rain that occurred during this battle, it caused the cannons to kind of sink in the dirt. They couldn't move it anymore. So they lost a lot of their artillery. So also with this defeat, it marks the rise of a superior military technology in Europe and the decline of the Ottoman power. You also have foreign problems that occur. They already lost parts of Eastern Europe and 3 centuries of rule, right? So they start losing parts of Europe. Russians defeat the Ottomans after a protracted war that claimed Crimea, present-day Ukraine. The Safavid front became active as well. So the Safavids started attacking the Ottomans. Local Christian minorities, often protected by European powers, started to, right? What's it called when people leave what's Scotland trying to do recently? Referendum, right? There were these referendums that were occurring from the European side. And even the European citizens lived and traded with impunity. Okay, so Ottoman's domestic issues, weakening provincial control rise, weakening provincial control. Man, today my tongue is a little bit tired. The rise of local provincial governors, the Mamluks, who the Ottomans had defeated, regained power. Nomadic tribes, the Bedouins, started attacking the Ottomans. The Arabian frontier, religious reform and dissent, the Wahhabi-Saudi alliance, etc. So you have internal problems along with foreign problems as well. Another major problem of the Ottomans was, by the time this happens in the 18th century, they start realizing Europe is going through a renaissance. Before that, they didn't really know. It's not like today where you have all these tourists going around and you have all these satellites that are spying on different countries, and there's a watchful eye on every mile of the earth, right? They didn't know this was going on. By the time they found out, they're like, oh my God, we are falling behind. They try and revive the culture. They try and make a cultural revolution. No. So one of the ways they try doing that is what's called Nizam Jadidi. So they try to do military reform. Selim III introduces Nizam-e-Jadid, the new system, new military schools, dress code, conscriptions, etc. Old military, which is called the Janissaries, and religious elite ulama revolted. All right. So now they're trying their attempts to introduce, to rejuvenate. Right. You know how, subhanAllah, I mean, with our times today, technologies, you find that. I'll just be straightforward. When I work with the previous generation, right, many of them aren't up to date when it comes to technology. Technology is changing fast. I mean, even me with the youth, I'm not up to date in their technologies. And the fact of the matter is, with the changing of technology, if we're not constantly updating, we fall behind very quick, right? So this is what was happening. Selim failed. So what happens is these two groups, they're revolted. It seems like they weren't ready to accept these changes, right? They liked the old way, or perhaps there were benefits that they were gaining, whatever it might be. When a people fall behind too much, now they're going to have to introduce a lot of changes all of a sudden. And people aren't ready for that quick of change. The change needs to be slow, right? Okay, let's change our couches. Tomorrow let's change, in a year let's change our carpet. Next year after that, let's paint the house. But if the wife says, "Hey, we need to do the entire house. We need new furniture. We need new carpets. We need to paint everything," the guy is going to be slow down a little bit, right? I can't do that. Right. You also have the Tanzimat reforms in the 19th century, more thorough, ambitious. Instead of the Islamic ideals of the millet system, so they're trying to modernize. So during this time, modernity is being introduced. The Industrial Revolution is about to start, or if it hasn't already started. Steam and coal, right? So the Ottomans, before, what they tried doing was making a train track from Istanbul to Mecca. And in fact, a lot of it remains. So in Jordan, you see parts of it. And when the West heard about this, it really frightened them. Because with a train that leads from Istanbul to that distance, I mean, you're talking about, let's say from Amman to Mecca is about, let's say probably about 2,200 kilometers. And I'd say from Amman to Istanbul is probably another 1,000, if not more. let's say 1,500. So you're talking around 4,000 kilometers, around 2,700 miles. With a train, I mean, that would make them a lot more effective. So they tried doing that. By the time they finished it, or before they finished it, they were dissolved. So attempt to form an Ottomani nation state like European. We'll talk about the nation state because it's really interesting, and it's affecting us in many ways. All citizens equal before the law, right? All these are now Western ideas being introduced to the Muslim world. But whose law? What about freedoms, tradition? These things failed, right? And we'll talk about this inshallah once we talk about colonialism. What time is it? So modernization. During this time also in 1798, Napoleon enters Egypt, and this begins the colonization of Egypt. You have other things. Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was an Ottoman soldier who was designated by the Ottomans to govern Egypt, and he gained enough power to secede, right? To say that, you know what, I'm not going to listen to you guys. I'm my own sovereignty. And during this time, this is when Napoleon comes and they start introducing the nation state and all these other models. Okay, so let's stop there. Now we're getting a little bit too deep. Or you know what, we'll skip this. Oh, so during this time you have nationalism, Arab nationalism that rises. It was very much used by the colonizers to revolt against the Ottomans. So this is the map of the Ottoman Empire, and this shows you how they lost land, the time period. So they started losing these bright yellow, that's the earliest ones. And the next one, so the highest shade is the earliest, and it keeps going down until what's present-day Turkey, this region. So they start losing these lands, and they lose Egypt, Kuwait, they lose, and then they lose Syria, Iraq, Baghdad, these areas, and then Europe, until it becomes what's present-day Turkey. Okay, so inshallah next week, we'll stop there. Next week we'll talk very briefly about the Mughals, because there's a link between them and the Wahhabi movement. Yes, surprise, surprise. And I'll show you where that comes from, and maybe some lessons that we can learn from their experience. Allah Ta'ala alam. We'll also talk about colonialism as well. Any questions? Yes.
Go ahead. So I've heard that I don't know, maybe you know better based on your research on manuscripts. Is there like a signed treaty that happened at the end of the Ottoman Empire, like around 1923-24? I just heard that maybe through my research online. For the next 100 years, that like things are going to change.
Yeah. So what that is, I believe, is that if I didn't do the research, but I've heard from others that treaty is that the Turkey cannot claim a caliphate for 100 years, right? Now I don't know what they're thinking. 100 years. I don't. Maybe they thought, man, 100 years is so far down the line. By then, I don't know. Maybe time back then meant something different than what it means to us today. 10 years is absolutely nothing. Perhaps to them, 100 years, man, that's way down the line, right? That's what it is. And now you have these theories being built around, especially by more politically driven Muslim groups, that there's a theory that by 2023, right, Israel will collapse, right? It'll fall, and then the caliphate will be restored and whatnot. Look, let's just be very honest. All these it's in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By in the hands of Allah, I don't mean we don't do anything and just wait for something to change, right? But once we start building these theories and become emotionally attached to these theories, what if it doesn't happen? What if it doesn't happen? And now you have people deriving the Quran through equations, right? Suggest that Israel is going to collapse in the year 2022, right? Okay, what if it doesn't? Is the Quran wrong now, right? And then these hearts become attached. It's, yes, 2022, everything's going to change. 2022 is in 3 years, less. Do you really think these major changes are going to happen over the next 2 years? Things are changing. Things are changing, right? But in the next 2 years, 3 years, I mean, it's doubtful, right? Also, a lot of people are very, very attached to Erdogan. And he's doing fantastic work for his people. Even for the Muslims. I mean, who talks and defends the Muslims like him? No one does. Right? But what if Erdogan dies tomorrow? What then? Everything is lost? Right? We need to be attached to a message, not a person. Right? We are attached to La ilaha illallah. That's what drives us. Not the presence of a person or the possibility of something happening in the near future. Right? If it happens, say, alhamdulillah, we're not going to be mad. Right? What if it doesn't happen? Is that the end of the world? No.
Well, I only am sure of one point on this 1923
Yeah.
to 2023. There was a treaty that was signed.
Right.
I don't have the details of it, but the one significant point is that, Turkey controls the Bosphorus. And the Bosphorus is the only way in and out of the Black Sea. The Turks used to charge a toll for every ship that goes through that waterway.
Mm.
And that was disallowed when they surrendered to the British and French forces. They said you cannot charge or put a toll on any transshipment through this waterway for 100 years. That's the biggest thing they're afraid of, actually, is that come 2023, Turkey is going to say, okay, we've paid our price, now you start paying a toll. Now, that's a very expensive proposition for countries, especially like Russia, because a huge amount of trade goes through that waterway because Russia needs a warm water port.
Right.
So a lot of people are very concerned. That's why Erdogan is having a hard time, because they're really concerned about this toll business of the Bosphorus. What's going to happen here?
Right.
Because he could turn around and say, well, yeah, that was the deal, right? Now it's going to cost you $5 every time a ship goes through. I'm going to, there's a ticket in here.
Right.
Right. I think that this is a big problem. It's potentially, nobody wants to talk about it, but it could happen.
Right. So.
Maybe other things, but this one for sure.
I think if I remember correctly, and don't quote me on this, part of it was that a caliphate cannot be reestablished until 2020 for the next 100 years. Because originally, when the British, when the West dissolved the caliphate, they didn't dissolve it entirely. They left the caliph as kind of like a symbol, like a pope figure. Yeah. And then, like, you know what? How do you know in 10 years from now he's not going to change and become? These Muslims, they're not easy to deal with, right? They're not people who just stay quiet. So, like, let's just take it all away. That's what they did. And they actually, our brothers and sisters from the Desi world were the first to try and revive it. And that's actually what triggered the West to say, whoa, these people are trying to revive it, let's just dissolve it entirely. Yes. Because the Mughals were actually allies with the Ottomans. Yes. Other question? Yes, Julian.
I had a question about the map.
Which one?
The full extent of the Ottoman Empire. I think it was right there. I think it was the last one.
So that's actually when they start collapsing. This is the... No. This is it. This is the most land that they had.
Because I was wondering because I thought, like, when I saw the last one, that I was wondering if, like, Romania was on that map, or...
Well, it's fine. In 6th grade, we memorized all these countries. I don't know exactly where they are now. I'm not sure where Romania is. No, Romania is part of this, yes.
Because I thought
it's in this area.
When it was part of the yellow, and I don't know if it was just, like, taken out of the territory or something. Yeah. This is Romania at the top there.
Where is it?
Yeah.
Like right at the top right corner. Below Moldavia.
Moldavia, over here. Okay, what about it?
So that means it was part of it.
Yes. So yeah, it was part of it.
What is that Bessarabia? What is that?
What is it?
Like, what does that mean, Bessarabia? At the top, very top, right above Romania. Yeah. Is that like Belarus? Right above Romania.
Right above Romania. Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You don't know?
To Russia. I don't know. These might be older names, or it could be even. It might not even be in English. So a lot of these names are, for example, Turkish. I don't know. I'm not sure. So you see, for example, right here, Syria and Asia. And this is what we call today Libya. These are probably the older names, or the names during that time. Other questions? Yes.
Are there any records of like leading Islamic scholarship figures during the peak of the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, Abu Saud. Abu Saud, definitely. He has a tafsir, very, very effective, very powerful one. He was a major Hanafi scholar. Another one is Ibn Abidin. Ibn Abidin was in Damascus, but he was during the time of when colonialism started, right? And the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. Other major scholars during that time. Other major scholars were actually, yes, a lot of major scholars were actually in the Indian Pakistani region. Dahlawi, who else? Asindi, these other guys that were in in that area. Also, Shawkani in Yemen, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in Arabia. And we'll talk about that time, inshallah, next week. Yes?
You mentioned about the Ottomans that they were kind of powerful on the ulamas. You said ulamas, they
Yes.
can remove the sultans. How conservative the society was on that time? They were like, you said 49% versus...
So, the reading that I did, it said that in the Ottoman Empire, not the Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire, the population was 49% Muslim. Because you have a lot of all these European areas, right? They're all Muslim. They're non-Muslim. So it wasn't like Iraq, it wasn't like Iran and these areas where they started entering Islam in the 4th century, right? This was a little bit different. And perhaps that has to do with their sovereignty, right? They didn't really mix with the Muslims. Whereas in Iran, Iraq, they were mixing with the Muslims.
So in their daily religious practices, they were kind of...
SubhanAllah, I was just thinking about that today. I don't, it's hard to say how conservative. I mean, conservative, it's a very relative term. Back then, there was no liberals. You had practicing and non-practicing, or practicing and sinners. Really, that's what it was. But what percentage of Muslims were praying their 5 daily prayers? It's hard to say. I don't know. But I'd guess it's the vast majority.
So power-wise, they were powerful because they could remove the sultans.
Mm-hmm.
So they could...
So their power is partly to do with the balance of power that the Ottomans made. So I try and draw similarities with these times and what's going on here in America. I mean, the Supreme Court is very powerful. Not just Supreme Court, a regular judge, a federal judge is very powerful. I mean, they can literally stop an executive order of the president. Right? And that's part of a healthy society, a healthy government. That balance of power. So they recognize this. Yes. Yes.
Are you going to talk about the Ottomans' role in the First World War?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. My great-grandfather was part of that, and he died in Russia. Yeah. His name was Mahmud. So he was part of the Ottoman army. He died in Russia because of the cold. Rahmatullah alayh. Other questions? Yeah, but I don't think I'm going to get into that. Any other questions? Yes.
We learned from the science that the European countries retained their population, retained their religions.
Yes.
Commerce was a defining factor there. But there are some European countries like Bosnia and Albania, which are Muslim, the population is Muslim even now.
Right.
When did that happen and how did that happen?
I'm not sure. I was thinking maybe after the series, we can have our brothers and sisters from Bosnia, from Croatia, we have some in Kosovo, to give us their story. How did Islam enter their areas? Right. That'd be interesting. Mm-hmm. Other questions? All right. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I thank you for your patience.